Good morning. I'm here with Bloomberg opinion columnist Shuli who is based in Hong Kong and has been covering and writing about Evergrande, the Chinese real estate developer, which is which is the most indebted in the world, um, is is on its knees. Shuli has been writing about Evergrande for a very long time and knows the ins and outs and all the financial intricacies around this large Chinese real estate developer. So we're going to get into it, and we're here to answer all the questions that have come to us from readers and investors and several others who have been closely watching Evergrande. Shuli, amazing work. Here are a couple things that we want to discuss. One of the things that people have really been talking about is that Evergrande has for years, had these moments where suddenly everyone was wondering, is the company going to be able to pay its dues? And this time, this mid autumn festival time, it really did come to its knees. So what happened, and why has this happened now?
Anjani, absolutely. Evergrande has been called a cat with nine lives. They have a lot of liquidity crisis over the years, right? Like short sellers have been shorting them for a good decade in Hong Kong. But every time it has survived. But the problem with Evergrande, using a cat analogy, is this cat got too fat. And this time, with China's a common prosperity drive, and then sudden pull out of a supply chain financing options, that cat just had to go on to a diet too fast, and it just couldn't make it.
It couldn't make it. So basically, there was a lot of bills due, and
yes.
it really didn't have the means. So by the numbers, we always think about China as everything seems larger in China. By the numbers, everything is always larger than life. Can you put Evergrande in context for us?
So Evergrande, Evergrande's most of their projects are actually not in the first tier cities of Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. It's actually spread out across the smaller cities. And just to give you context, in China, third-tier cities is a population of 500,000 to 3 billion. That's a lot.
Right.
And then this time, when Evergrande is doing that restructuring, it has sold 1.6 million apartments pre-sold. These apartments have not even been built. So right now, the first problem that the government has to solve is to somehow find the money to build these 1.6 million apartments and to give to consumers who have already paid price. And that's the scale of China. 1.6 million feels like a lot, right, for the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
We're talking about 5 to 6 million people not having housing.
Wow. And what about the financial state? So Evergrande's got over 300 billion in debt due. Is that correct?
Yes. So Evergrande, interestingly enough, Evergrande actually got really big during President Xi Jinping's reign. Starting between 2016 and 2020, its total liabilities almost doubled to $300 billion. And it's pretty interesting because starting late 2017, President Xi has been on the corporate deleveraging campaign. So you do wonder why Evergrande got bigger, whereas everyone else was asked to be smaller.
So who do they, this 300 billion, that makes them the most indebted real estate developer in the world. Who do they owe this money to?
So Evergrande pretty much got money from everybody, suppliers, banks, trust companies, and a lot of money was owed to foreign investors. Evergrande is Asia's largest high-yield dollar bond issuer. It has about 20 billion US dollars bonds outstanding, and the foreigners have a big chunk of that.
Right. So, this has obviously been playing out, and there's been a lot of anxiety in global markets as to whether this is systemic enough to, cause contagion and have wider ramifications. How would you, do you think there will be some form of contagion, whether or not it's, there's lack of confidence, whether it's the way people look at China? What do you think happens in terms of contagion from this specific situation?
I would prefer to be on the optimistic side. I mean, Evergrande is big, but it's about as big as Unbound Insurance or HNA, which you have written a lot about. And Evergrande actually is not a a financial company. It's a real estate developer. In the worst case, it has the land banks, it has the unfinished projects. So in a sense, the recovery rate for like Chinese consumers and suppliers are better. On the contagion part, like global markets a little bit freaked out, in part because of Evergrande's dollar bond issues outside of China, and also it has like. Apparently, last year it had relationships with the 128 banks. It didn't say which banks, but you do want to know, well, how about HSBC? How about your JP Morgan, Citi? They're all big players in the Hong Kong market, right? So there is a little bit of a jittery there as well.
Interesting. So, you've taken the optimistic side, but what's the worst case scenario in terms of an end game, if there is an end game?
I think the worst case scenario will be street protests in China. I mean, Evergrande owes everyone a lot of money, and we're talking about consumers who bought apartments from them. That Evergrande also sold wealth management products to its consumers, to its employees, and the small business suppliers. And there could be a lot of protests, and the government really didn't want to deal with that. So I think that would be very ugly.
Interesting. So talk to us about, what exactly was the issue or is the issue with Evergrande? You've written about this, you've written about inventory and working capital. Talk to us about that, because I think that's a question that hasn't been answered. People are selling stocks and bonds before they're really asking the question of what exactly went wrong this time.
That is definitely a problem, but we have talked about indebtedness a lot, right? China's debt pile is bigger than the rest of the world, so on and so forth. We have talked a lot about that. But one question that I think people need to start digging is like, how about working capital management? I mean, in the past year, we have seen some disruption of supply chain financing. Greensill was an example, right? Like what happened when Greensill went bust? Some of Masa-san's unicorn startups, they also went bust. And the Evergrande's problem is a working capital problem. It was stretched too thin. The cash churn was too high. Like it has too little working capital cash. So I think that people need to start looking at the supply chain financing from now on.
Interesting. That's a fascinating subject, and I know that that's really, exploded in China over the last few years because it's, the companies have looked for access to capital, and much like Evergrande, this was just another funding channel for them, including their own customers. But all of this has really happened over the last, I'd say, as you said earlier, 2016 to maybe 2020, over last year, really. How did Evergrande get this big and get to this point under the reign of President Xi Jinping?
I think billionaire founder Xu Jiaying, he was quite politically correct and connected. So in the well-cited 2018 speech, he was talking about common prosperity, and that was way ahead of time. That was way ahead of President Xi waking up the Chinese society with the common prosperity thing, right? So and the apartments that the clientele that he catered to were the smaller city, tier 3 city consumers. So he felt that he was doing the politically correct thing. And the local governments, when you have China's second largest developer coming to a small city, the red carpet's out, So I think he was playing the wokeism with Chinese characteristics game.
That's interesting. So, I want to wrap this up, and I'm going to ask you one last question. What should foreign investors be thinking right now? Where do things stand? They had a bond payment due yesterday, and how should foreign investors be thinking about this?
I think there are two things I want to make. One is, why hasn't China formed a creditors committee? I mean, Evergrande, everybody is expecting it to default, right? Like, why hasn't China formed a credit committee? And therefore, what's your recovery rate like? Like, ask China about that. Number two is, I think people need to start looking at the supply chain financing from now on.
Fascinating. Shuli Ren of Bloomberg Opinion, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for answering pressing questions on Evergrande. We'll come to you with more later. Thank you.